energy, and I'm going to say how I think that fits with what other people say about energy, what we normally think about as energy, sensible sort of energy policy. And then we're going to look at some alternative visions of energy futures and moving away from the abundance thing. What other visions have we got and how are they sort of landing with people? And concluding remarks. And as it said, warning, there will be a few digressions. There will be a few digressions, but hopefully, you know, you'll follow me and we'll make sense of it together. Okay, so this is a couple of quotes from the book. One is from one of the start and the other one is from the end. And you can see what it says. It says, this book is dedicated to a simple idea. To have the future we want, we need to build and invent more of what we want. That's it. That's the thesis. And then they they spin their book out from this. So it's about building things. And right at the end, this is how they kind of conclude. Abundance contains within it a bigness that benefits the American project. It is the promise not just more, but more of what matters. So you can see it's a book that is written totally in the American context. I'm not sure that they might occasionally mention other countries. That's not really what they're doing. They're trying to solve an American problem, and that's their frame of reference, which is fine. But it's just to know, those of us who are not American, sometimes, so I don't understand all the sort of political nuances of some of the things they're talking about in here. It will mean a lot to Americans. It might not mean a lot to other people. That's what they sort of set out. And they start the book with this kind of extended vision of what life could be like in 2050, which obviously is not, I mean, it's 25 years away, but it's not impossibly far in the future. And these are the sorts of things they're saying. There's a few pages, there's quite a lot of detail. And you can sort of read it here. They're talking about solar panels, blinking in the morning sun. They're talking about where the energy has come from. So I'm focusing on the energy bit here. We've got small nuclear power, we've got geothermal, we've got our own solar panels here. And as it said, 40 years ago, your parents filled their bedrooms with jewels fresh out of coal mines and oil pits. Today, that seems barbaric. And then it says, you live in a cocoon of energy so clean it barely leaves a carbon trace. It's so cheap you can scarcely find it on your monthly bill. This is an old fantasy, really, of, you know, totally abundant, consequence-free energy, and this is what they base a lot of their vision around, which is a nice idea. It's really a nice idea, but the question is, can we take them remotely seriously? So there's a kind of phrase in energy history, which is too cheap to meter. Energy will be too cheap to meter. And this sort of, I mean, if you're younger, you might not have heard of this. If you're kind of middle-aged and above, you probably will have. And it's a phrase that came out. It was a sort of statement that was said in the early days of sort of commercializing nuclear power. And even at the time, a lot of the nuclear power companies were going, oh, no, don't say that. That's not necessarily true. But nevertheless, it stuck and it really resonated. And it's sometimes used as a stick to beat the nuclear industry with, like, you've never met this promise of too cheap to meter. But I think it's also used as this kind of idea that at one point this was a reasonable aspiration that people could have about future choices of energy and future types of energy. And so it's just worth bearing in mind when you're hearing this, it's incredibly abundant. You won't even see it on your energy bill. Those kind of ideas have got really quite a long history, and they can be used to help thinking, and they can also be used to give a kind of distort thinking about what is reasonable to expect. Some more of their vision. Again, obviously there's quite a lot. There's a paragraph here about transport, and it talks about electric cars and trucks glide down the road. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen a truck gliding down a road. I feel that language is a little bit problematic. But anyway, so they've got this view of everything's electric, which, you know, we're seeing quite a lot of at the moment. And in fact, a lot of our transport models have got exactly that in it. We might not promise they glide, but we might say that. Delivery drones are dropping like hummingbirds from the sky. Well, you know, okay, so that's what they're imagining. And then they go on to say, and thanks to higher productivity from AI, most people will be, you know, people can complete what used to be a full week of work in a few days. So it's this idea that we're not going to have to work as hard anymore. We're going to have more money, more leisure time, gliding trucks. That's nice. It is nice. Again, I think it's worth just this is another digression. It's worth just looking back slightly at the idea of shorter working weeks. Again, it's something people talk about. They talk about it quite seriously in sort of sufficiency and degrowth literature as well. So it's an idea that appeals, for obvious reasons, to lots of people. One of the people who talked about it previously was a British economist called John Maynard Keynes. And he was writing in 1930, so a long time ago, and he was looking forward 100 years. They're only looking forward 25 years, right? He was looking forward 100 years, and he was thinking, I can imagine that by then, if we don't have any more big wars, unfortunately not the case, if we don't have any population growth, also not the case, we might get to the point where people can all meet their needs by just working 15 hours a week. So that's what he was hoping for. And as we know, lots of stuff has happened. Unfortunately, there was a massive, global war not that far in the future. And obviously there's been huge population growth, which is a lot of that is great because it's a success, for us as human beings. We're not all dying prematurely anymore. But it's just another reminder that this idea of, through productivity, we'll all become wealthier and then we won't need to work as much anymore is another idea that has a long history and then sort of over promises and under delivers so far. So it's just worth bearing that in mind. Okay, so that's the sort of introductory remarks. If we look at what the book is really trying to do, there's the kind of first paragraph the first bullet point gives a summary there. And so it's trying to understand in their view, why hasn't America made enough progress on major projects? They're particularly thinking about housing. They're very concerned about the lack of affordable housing, obviously a problem in lots of wealthy countries, including the US. They're concerned about infrastructure, what's not getting built. They take one particular example of a rail line in California and talk about how that hasn't got built. And they're concerned about climate change. So these people are not climate deniers, but they are concerned. That's part of what needs to get built to resolve problems. And one of the key problems they're interested in is climate change. They think a lot about what's stopping things growth as in economic growth. They see economic growth very much as the solution and degrowth as rapid collective scarcity. And we'll come back to that. So really not interested in ideas like that. They want the US to take invention more seriously. And I think their sort of analysis is really based on insights from sort of economics, policy, and sort of culture. They're not writing in an academic style. They're writing in a sort of think tanky, big picture, let's persuade politicians and civil society type style. It's a popular book. It's been on the sort of New York Times bestseller list. I'm sure they've sold far more people have read this than will ever read anything most of us will write. So it's, they're aiming to be popular and persuasive. They want to rethink American politics. They're quite concerned that this kind of total polarization of opinion in America is leading to a lot of problems. And they regard themselves as liberals, sort of centre-left, I guess, and they're saying to be successful again in the light of, having lost the presidential election, the Democrats having lost that, liberalism needs to become a political movement that builds. So that's what they're trying to do, set out a new agenda for the sort of centre and the left of American politics. And I'm just going to pick up 3 reviews here because they all make quite interesting points. I mean, I'm sure there were lots of positive reviews as well, but I'm just going to try and pick out a few of the critiques that I think are quite interesting. So this is one. This was published in The Guardian. I think what's quite interesting is they think, well, where is this vision coming from? And they talk about every political movement has an image of the past that motivates its view of the future. And in fact, the authors talk about that, saying to be successful in politics, you need to you have a vision of the future that builds on sort of past virtues. And they say they think the authors are really inspired by this thing called Futurama. Right, I didn't put a colour picture in because I was a bit worried about copyright. I think I'm all right with this one. And it's sort of it's a sort of vision of commuter flights to the moon. This is a living on the ocean floor, I think, this picture here. So there's a very sort of techno-futurist sort of view. And they're calling for this new politics to unravel this technology, a lot of which doesn't exist. And that's, it's a very, very tech forward book. That's what they're seeing as the solution. And they do talk about organisation and who does what, but mostly it's about enabling these technologies to roll out by having the right forms of political and social organisation. Yeah, well, maybe not social, sort of institutional organisation. And just as another aside, so this was the 1939 Futurama. So you can see this as a sort of vision of the great big I don't know, residential blocks or office blocks, and you can see cars everywhere, sort of. And this was the 1939 one, and it was designed by, sponsored by General Motors, a car company. I mean, I don't know if you could spot that from the picture that cars might have been important in designing this vision of the future. And then later in 1964, so there was another of these world fairs. And then they had the new Futurama, which is what the other ones were inspired by. But it's just quite interesting to look at, well, who's producing these future visions and what are their interests? Obviously, they think cars are a pretty good thing, and let's approach their future. Okay, another review that sort of picks apart some of the things that they're saying. And this is from the Los Angeles Review of Books. I mean, he sort of, I'm not going to read all of this out, but essentially this review, I picked out the bit that's talking a little bit more about the energy side, because obviously most of the book is not specifically about energy. That just underpins quite a lot of their vision. And this is an energy network, I'm talking about the energy bits. There's a lot of the political side that I'm not going to talk about. But they're sort of, he's characterising them as solutionists or eco-modernists. In other words, the idea that if you get the right technology, we can keep all our existing sort of economic and social structures and sort of have the lives we want with a lot less environmental impact. And obviously this author's thinking, well, that's, he doesn't believe in that as a solution. And it's a long debate in sort of environmental literatures between different sorts of positions around sustainable development and what's possible. But essentially this author's saying, well, this is an unrealistic vision that fails to engage with hard choices. So it's, in other words, it's not that helpful if you've got a fantastic vision, but there's no reality to it. And then the final one I was going to pick up, because again, this is just about whose vision, right? So this review sort of is being quite critical from the point of view about whose vision of the future is this. And the author suggests that the transportation, so we've seen the pictures of the previous General Motors kind of vision, and they're saying their transportation future says much more about self-driving electric vehicles than it does about mass public transport. And so they're saying it's the familiar futurism of tech oligarchs. So obviously they're being, very critical. Now, if you like the future vision of tech oligarchs, I suppose that's not critical, it's just descriptive. But they're seeing it as, criticism. This is the sort of future it is. So my other slight, version, I thought I'd share something from, so other weekend, I was in Eindhoven. So there for a conference first now. I went to see this thing, and they've got a wonderful exhibition. This is called they're now called the Next Nature Museum, but I think it was Evolution was called. It's this thing called Retro Future, the Future of Yesterday. It's a very cool book, and it's full of all these kind of 1900s to 2000 views of the future. And they've also looked at flying cars, and they've got all these descriptions of flying cars that go back a long way, longer than you'd think. And they've got this kind of nice digitally altered photography, which I haven't put up there because, again, I'm a bit worried about the copyright. But as you can see, it's a nice picture of a VW camper van, no wheels. They've got quite a few of these kind of, they've got other ones as well, but I like the camper van the best. But, you can also have a little sporty number that flies. And I mean, it was quite a playful exhibition, but it was looking at all these different sorts of visions. And I don't know, the kind of visions of the future used to be a bit more exciting, really. So that's one place we can think about that. And as this is their piece, one of the pieces of their exhibition, and they have self-driving cars as imagined in 1957. And it's, to be honest, it's a picture of what you could do in your self-driving car. It's probably the same picture, same thing we're selling ourselves today, isn't it? The car will just carry on nice and safely, and you can all play your board game in the back of the car. I suppose now it shows everybody staring at screens, but I mean, it's, it's the same idea, which is, it's kind of, sometimes I think we all forget how long some of our visions have been around, and that maybe we're still having the same visions we were having sort of 50, 60, 70 years ago in some respects. The other bit of my holiday snaps I'd sort of show you is this is another vision museum of the future, and this is the whole museum of the future. It's called Futurium. This is in Berlin, and it's an amazing museum. It's a really amazing museum, and everything, as they say, everything revolves around the question of how do we want to live. And so they have whole sections on, they do cities, transport, energy, food, health, all sorts of different aspects. And the little picture on the far side there is one of they have all these little bubbles of things. You can see it's a bunch of sort of floating wind turbines around some kind of energy island with the fish happily swimming underneath. And they have a whole set of ideas that you can look at. But I think one of the things I quite liked there is you can see this is a quote in one particular part of the exhibition, and it says, "Where are the future stories speaking of hope?" And that's a really good question. And obviously that's what the abundance, people are trying to do. They're trying to give a really hopeful message about the kind of future we could have if we just did the right things. And it's important to have that there. Somebody was asking me whether in this museum, whether it was mostly utopias or dystopias, and it was mostly hopeful futures, utopias or techno visions of a future that would be better, apart from the bit that was about the environmental movement. And that's just bringing it down, talking about limits to growth and all that kind of thing. So yes, I feel that's a challenge. So if we go back to the energy again, what are they thinking about when they're talking about abundance in their energy vision? So they want to electrify everything. They want zero carbon electricity supply from nuclear and renewables. Okay, kind of the ordinary. They want to massively increase the supply of renewable energy. They don't talk about limits. And they say we're going to need some new technologies because they're not, and particularly around airline travel, cement, carbon removal from the atmosphere. So that's their kind of vision. So how is that different from the sorts of things we might see in, let's say, the Committee on Climate Change, or sort of presentations we might make in this department or in engineering? I mean, bits of it are exactly the same. So we can debate this at the end, but I think this is a fairly standard presentation of what we need to do to get to, let's say, net zero by 2050. We need to reduce the demand for energy. We need to shift to electricity, as I said. We need to supply electricity from non-fossil fuel sources, that's renewables and nuclear. We need carbon capture and storage for the remaining fossil fuels in the system. And we need all the social policy, governance, etc. changes to enable all this stuff to happen. So I think, some of it's the same. I think the things that are really different is they don't reduce energy, reduce demand for energy, use energy more efficiently. That's not in their vision. And they're not going into the details, so they're not thinking about flexibility and storage and things like that very much. They're mostly about, let's just build more, and it needs to be this kind of thing. That's mostly what they're talking about. And I think this kind of not mentioning the demand side, so not even energy efficiency, which like even people with tech future sort of visions usually tend to mention that. I mean, okay, yeah, it's boring, but I mean, it's been really important in terms of where we're getting to in terms of our meeting our net zero goals, but they don't mention it. It's not part of the message that they're selling. So they've got this very asymmetric understanding. They're only focusing on the supply side. They're not saying a huge amount about the bit in between, and they're not saying anything on the demand side. It's just that's just got to keep going up because that's what people want. That's their basic thesis. The energy from renewables, great, but they really don't. I mean, they're not energy analysts, and they're not trying to write a very systematic, serious report, but they very much skate over any problems whatsoever of generating all this new electricity. So let's just have lots of little nuclear power plants everywhere. Okay, let's just put, have masses of solar everywhere. Yeah, exactly, but not. I mean, it's not remotely that easy. Of course, it isn't. I think that's that's one of the. And they don't really talk about other forms of energy. So they're not talking about abundance. They sort of mention carbon capture and storage and things like that, but they're not, but they don't really talk about biomass or sort of having lots of fossil fuels still, but we're going to do lots of carbon capture. That's not really part of their thing. They're really totally focused on electricity. Which, when, as we know, sort of even in the US now, probably sort of 80% of their energy use isn't electricity. It's sort of, you know, there's a lot of stuff they're not talking about. So that was then. So now I'm just going to give you fairly briefly, give a few different views, because, you know, I mean, I can see why people want to believe it. I mean, I quite want to believe it. It would be nice. I mean, I don't like their tech-bro future of the trucks gliding along and sort of things dropping out of the sky all the time. But the idea of, I mean, who wouldn't like sort of consequence-free, as much energy as you want to do the things that matter to you in life? Of course, that's really attractive. And what have we got? People like me are going, well, you know, it's not really very practical. What have we got that's going to be more persuasive as a vision than that? And so that's what I wanted to do, is go through a few of the ideas that are around, and then at the end come back to, well, are these going to work? Is this going to deliver? You know, is this going to inspire people and deliver change? So the first one, I suspect all of you have heard of this, which is Donut Economics by Kate Raworth, who's attached to this department. She has created a framework which includes human rights and not exceeding planetary boundaries. This is what she calls the area inside the donut, where we should have a safe and just space for humanity, and we have inclusive and sustainable economic development. So it meets the sort of human development goal, keeps us planetarily safe. And she's starting to work out what that means with her. I think she's got a Donut Economics Action Lab where they're trying to put this in place and use the economic principles in her book to do sort of economic development differently. So that's a big vision, and it's been very inspiring to lots of people, and some cities and places are trying to take it up. So this has been inspiring, and it's not based on the infinite everything, no limits sort of philosophy that abundance is based on, because it's, you know, it's right there in the picture. It's about respecting limits. So that's interesting. That's a powerful alternative vision. A colleague and I, Sarah Darby and I, would try to use that vision and to use it to talk about energy sufficiency. So I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but that was trying to look at, well, what does that donut mean for energy? If we think about energy services that people, how could we make a definition of that and use that to inform our research? But talking about energy sufficiency is sort of a different talk. So I'm going to move on from that. Another framing, which is one of the ones they do give a bit of a kicking to in this book, is Jason Hickel and Less is More. I don't know how many people have heard of this book or sort of seen this book. Yeah, so some of you. So this is a sort of, again, it's a popular book. It's the sort of same, it's probably more referenced in this book, but it's a similar sort of style, trying to reach a popular audience. And he, well, as you can see, how degrowth can save the world. So it's on the same sort of big picture thinking as this one. And you can see we've got sort of pull quotes. Actually, Penguin website, very bad. You can't get to the end of these quotes on their website. So I've given you incomplete quotes because I've just pinched them off their website, partly because this is Kate Raworth, who we've just talked about, and Danny Dorling, who's a professor in this department. So I just thought I'd show you the locals. I think there's quite a lot in this. But not surprisingly, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson think degrowth is a terrible, terrible, terrible idea, and they devote a few pages to sort of to critiquing it. And they will not be the only people who think it's a terrible idea, but just to note, they see it as completely the opposite of what they're trying to do. Slightly more modestly, we had a research centre that was based in Oxford. It was a multi-university research centre that ran for 5 years. Called CREDS, which is the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. So it focused on demand, and this was the sort of picture I was involved with that. This is the picture we were using at the start. What should we be thinking about if we want to help do research that is contributing to a sort of transition to net zero, a just transition to net zero? And it was talking about things like improving energy efficiency. That's the classic. And flexing energy demand in time, switch fuels to lower carbon fuels. But the big one that CREDS was trying to include was change energy using activities. So it's trying to think beyond just what we've got now is what we must always have, and think a bit more broadly about, well, what does it mean if you want to meet net zero? What do you have to do? So that might be, it might be, the typical example of, have a phone call instead of make a visit, or, have a video call, do a Teams call instead of, going down to London for your visit, to meet for your next project meeting. Decide that you're going to holiday closer to home, decide that you're going to hang your clothes out if it's a sunny day rather than use your tumble dryer to dry your washing. Some of those are trivial examples, but it was trying to go beyond efficiency. And one of the things that CREDS did was it did scenarios for the whole of the UK economy. So this is everything up to 2050. And it looked at this is energy demand reduction modelling. So it looked at how could we reduce demand for energy across the economy, assuming population growth, assuming economic growth, where can we get to? And the most ambitious scenario was the one that was called transform, and that halved the energy use in the economy. And if you do that, then obviously it's hugely cheaper and easier to meet that set of energy needs with renewable energy. Right, so that was and this I think this was done about 2021, 22, and they've done more. There's been more detailed modelling. I mean, this is underpinned by a lot of detailed modelling by sector, but there's been more modelling done since then, led by other people looking in real detail. And the transform one includes all of those things we saw in the overview. So, for example, on the food side, it includes eating less meat. It includes travelling a bit less far, as well as super efficient homes and all that kind of stuff. So it's ambitious. It's ambitious as a vision, and the question is it a persuasive vision? Just got a couple more before we move to the discussion. I'm introducing this because I'm going to show you a sort of solution, if you like. So one of our colleagues here, Christian Brand, sort of created, I think, this new portmanteau word, mobesity, so immobility and obesity, to talk about the fact that cars in particular are getting a lot bigger and heavier. And there's kind of various figures that people come out with. But if you look, you see the ones that the sort of International Energy Agency have come out with. They're talking basically saying, because we're going for SUVs and bigger cars now, we have nullified what we could have saved in energy from energy efficiency. We haven't done. And I think there are some analysis that show it's almost even worse than that. So we've got this sort of, we can move around perfectly safely and happily in our smaller cars, but we're not. And there's all sorts of reasons why this is happening. But where does that fit into a vision? Well, one of our colleagues, I just thought I'd show you this because I think it's quite fun. Martin is starting up a little charity. So he's trying to find a new language to talk to people about making choices that are about you sort of using, having smaller cars. So he's called it the Car Climate Pledge, small car, big deal. It says we drive cars that fit our needs. And I mean, obviously, if it works, I mean, he's only just started this up. I'm sharing it with you in case you've got any thoughts. Do get in touch with Martin. He'd be delighted to hear them. But how does that work? It's on abundance. Let's have everything. To actually, we're going to have what we need. I mean, how's that messaging going to work? Is it going to work? He's trying it. He's trying it, and that's probably what we need to do. Actually, experiment with things. And one I've been involved with, which was sort of led by one of my former PhD students, called the Museum of Climate Hope. And again, that's trying to find ways of communicating messages of hope. In this case, working with the arts sector and working with the Oxford University Museums and a local school, Cheney Secondary School has got its own museum, so working with them as well, and using the existing collections to tell stories of climate hope. And this is particularly aimed at children, young people, coming out of all the climate strikes, knowing about climate anxiety, realising that climate hope is actually really important for educational reasons, but it's also a set of stories. So it's using objects and saying, how can we tell a hopeful story? And I think in this case, it was kind of, what did we have? I always forget these, which I really, really shouldn't. It's something like resilience. invention, and there was one other positive word that we used to find objects that embodied that. So, for example, like we have a 4,000-year-old iron cauldron is one of the objects in the Museum of Climate Hope because it's been patched a lot over time, and it was a big cauldron for community celebration. So the idea is a sort of collective object that's been highly valued, it's been kept in use all this time, probably had a spiritual value as well, and it's a beautiful object, right? And so it sort of embodies a lot of positive things about human society and what we value, and that's why it's a story of hope. So I suppose where I was trying to get to all this is, well, you know, I've critiqued abundance, other people have critiqued it, but it's like a really powerful idea. And what have we got that is going to work as well as that? If we're trying to take people with us, if we're trying to make the case for the big changes that need to happen, can we do it? You know, we've got various frames that are coming around. We've got energy independence. Some people talk about energy security as a way of saying, well, we can't use fossil fuels because they're all coming from out there. If we use renewables, that's our stuff. Therefore, you can tell a positive story about that. Self-sufficiency, so rather like energy independence, but perhaps at a smaller scale. Energy justice, that's used a lot as a framing, but some of these are very, I mean, in a way, abundance, I suppose you could say, is an abstract quality, but they bring it down to the human very quickly. Like the first pages are all about what will your life be like if this agenda is followed. I think we sometimes don't do that stuff because it's harder. Because if the energy system's working really well, like you just shouldn't be aware of it, it shouldn't matter. It's just in the background. Okay, so my concluding remarks are, should we just ignore all this stuff and stick to our science? I mean, that would be one approach. Just go, well, they don't know what they're talking about. It's, you know, some of this is, you know, technically nonsense. Does it matter? But I don't really think we can, because we know the politics around net zero and things are changing. We know the public conversation is, I mean, we shouldn't exaggerate that, but it is particularly worrying to me that the British Conservative Party sort of moved away from the net zero pledge. I find that really worrying. Having been quite smug about, oh yes, we've got political consensus in the UK, you know, we've all signed up to this, and that seems to be crumbling. And of course, we're not the only country where that's the case. That worries me. And I think the abundance narrative is obviously attractive. Of course it is. We've seen how this narrative keeps coming back through recent times. We could go back further. We'd probably find the ancient Greeks were saying exactly the same thing they normally were. So, I mean, can less is more, which was, the Jason Hickel's book, be persuasive when more and more is the competing ideal? I mean, can it? How are we going to do it? So I started with my question was saying, was it a powerful vision for a better future or a flawed fantasy? And I think it's probably both, actually. I mean, it probably is. It's powerful. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's deliverable. But I do think it's very, very powerful. And that means we have to kind of address it in some way. I mean, I think we've got the science on our side. We've got endless, very good technical analysis of how we can get to net zero through Committee on Climate Change. All sorts of people are doing analysis, lots of bright people coming with new technologies, new forms of social organisation. But I'm not sure we've got the stories on our side yet. And that's what they're telling a story. And I don't know that we've got them. And I wonder a bit about the sort of nature, whether we can learn from our colleagues who do sort of work on nature. I mean, this might be a bit of a fantasy, this might be my fantasy, right? But seems to me that a few years ago, it was all about nature conservation, which is a bit like, oh, let's look after the tiny bit that's left. And then there was this kind of explosion of interest in rewilding, which sounds a lot more exciting than nature conservation, even if it's basically the same thing. It sounds a lot more exciting. And it has got a bigger agenda, actually. Now there's nature recovery. We've got a Lever Hume Centre for Nature Recovery. And recovery, again, it's a bigger word, isn't it? It just feels like the vision is very positive. There's something really positive you're running towards, rather than go, oh my goodness, there's limits out there, we better do something. And so I feel like exploring futures with artists and architects and museums and things must be part of this, because they'll be able to come out with language and vision and images that, us as scientists or social scientists, that's probably not what we're best at. We can do the careful analysis, but can we make the things that are really resonant culturally? I don't know. And so this is where I wanted to stop, really. I just wondered what you all thought about that. Am I right about that we've got the science, but, not necessarily the stories, or have we got the stories? And it's just I get stuck when I go and give talks about sufficiency, and people go, yes, but you know, are you really serious? What's my business going to do about this? And I find it quite hard to be succinct and persuasive without going quite a long way outside my comfort zone. I'm not talking within the energy system then, I'm talking about values and morality and justice, and all, and I want a vision that I can sell where I've got some authority to sell it. So anyway, I'll stop waffling. Thank you for your attention, and let's have a discussion.
Abundance feed in the experience curve and learning. Because in many parts of the world don't have enough energy by any means, and building more and more solar has the advantage of bringing the price down. So you can sort of say, well, this abundance narrative is positive in that, because if we follow it through, we give people who don't have, particularly in the global south. And so that is does make it attractive, and we benefit indirectly.
Yeah, no, for sure, and they sort of recognise that. And in fact, lots of people. So our Jan Resnow, our sort of the energy group team leader. I mean, he was linked in one of his many media appearances the other day, was talking about the real importance of the fact that solar costs are just coming down and down, and how much opportunity that gives to lots of people to benefit. So yeah, for sure. I mean, they're very keen on that. I guess everybody's pretty keen on that.
So, I mean, I think with we got the science on our side. I mean, I think technically it's correct, but as a tool of persuasion, it's never really seemed to me to be very valuable, because the only time, the point at which everyone will recognise that the science was on one side will be at a point of calamity, and we're all trying to do out what we can to avoid that point of calamity. And so I kind of think, to me, abundance was a word that was designed to counter the phrase "drill baby drill." The drill baby drill types, they don't care about science, or maybe they think they've got the science on their side. That was a message of expansion and hope, and I think maybe that side of politics possibly kind of hijacked the narrative, the hopeful, the positive narrative. This is an attempt at trying to wrangle it back.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I mean, they, as I briefly mentioned, they do very much say, well, we're from the liberal side of politics, and we're trying to create a.
And I would go as far to say they're political. The Democrat. I mean, Klein really is a democratic political activist.
Yeah, and they sort of do quite a lot of their analysis in the book, which I didn't go into, is sort of the politics of more statist versus more sort of entrepreneurial sort of market solutions, and they're sort of picking bits from one and the other. It's it's sort of a third way, but politically they critique both sides, and they critique liberalism quite a lot. And one of their big critiques is that environmental rules are getting in the way of sensible building of various forms of infrastructure of which they approve. Now, it's a bit like cutting the red tape, isn't it? Everybody's always in favour of cutting the red tape, but whether it's got real meaning, I don't know.
I think one of the reasons it's so attractive is because it fits, right? It fits with this historic, liberalising project globally, and this whole myth of manufactured and artificial scarcity under capitalism. This idea that we don't have enough, and we couldn't possibly have enough without building. But I think when you pick into it, and as your quotes were saying about how it's relatively uncritical about its understanding of what actually is abundance, and what do we need to reach to get abundance, particularly in the American context where they have such high per capita GDP, and still not everyone has enough, only certain people have enough. I think it begs the question, well, what is abundance? What is abundance for everyone? Are we not there already yet? And it's just a case of reconfiguring, because I feel like most of the people who read that book in an American context will likely live in states of abundance already. I mean, what do we want an electric self-driving car for? Play a board game in a car when you can do that on a train already. So I think that uncritical perspective on what abundance is, and the idea that we produce enough food and grain to feed everyone on the planet already. It's just most of it goes to feeding animals, and most of it goes to biofuels, and it's the relations around that production that stop abundance happening. So I think that could be quite interesting.
Yeah, they're certainly not interested in distributional impacts and who's got enough and who hasn't. And if you did, as you said, look at that.
I think for that, of like the question of what is abundance, I was wondering that when you're speaking to like say businesses or communicating the science around sufficiency, how are you defining sufficiency? Like, is that something within like a scientific remit that you would feel comfortable of kind of telling a story about what is sufficiency, or is there a scientific definition of sufficiency that
I think
you can use?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, being an academic thing, there's lots of different definitions, right? I tend to work on something a bit like this. Is about meeting people's needs, but not necessarily all their wants, and staying within planetary boundaries. But of course, separating needs and wants is completely against most of the sort of economic thinking that we do. Although there is some quite good social science showing that actually people do make a distinction between those two. I mean, as you can imagine, there's a lot of literature on can you distinguish these two things? Is it intellectually coherent to do so? On what grounds? But there's also some quite nice work using groups of people to look at what's a decent standard of living in the UK, what's a minimum income that people can live a decent life on. And you get quite a lot of agreement around what sort of goods and services people need to live a decent life. And so you could say that is a bit like thinking about sufficiency. So I think there is, so in a sense, I think there's certainly some social science around what is acceptable now in terms of what we think most people agree is enough. People might want more than enough, but there's some sort of agreement around that, I suppose. But that's saying all that, that's quite a lot of words, isn't it? And that's a sort of individual focused thing, whereas you might also want to look at societal level and you want to look at businesses and what kind of businesses do we want, and that's a whole other set of evidence and arguments. So I was I haven't put it on here, but with two other authors, with Marlene Sahakian from University of Geneva and Sarah Darby, we did a special issue where we sort of had, it was all about sufficiency. Lots of different portals across Europe presented work, and they were looking at a whole range of things, a lot of them around housing, but also around businesses and transport, and trying to do experiments and do. So there is some evidence, people are trying things, trying to work what works, what actually makes a difference, but it was quite small scale, if I'm honest.
So I'm not at all an expert in this, and I've written none of the books, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But it kind of strikes me that the abundance book is, if you have a spectrum, the abundance book is at one extreme, and then the sufficiency aspect is at the opposite end of the spectrum. There is a theory which I remember from my master's, and I just wanted to mention it. It's called ecological modernization.
Yes.
Which I don't know if it kind of provides a middle ground between the two, which kind of still offers an optimist perspective of like we can decarbonize but create economic growth as we're decarbonizing, and it kind of bridges the two needs of the two ends of the spectrum. But again, I don't remember it in enough detail to say if it is a good answer to this question or not. But in terms of the other thing that I would say, I could be wrong, but I noticed in these discussions, so obviously energy and like people's lives are very, very connected, but there will always be distributional impact, distributional problems across the society. Even if energy were free for everyone, they would just come from somewhere else, not from energy. So maybe if we could disentangle them a little bit, that could potentially help in finding ways to prevent the transformation towards net zero in more positive terms, rather than just at distributional impacts of it.
I mean, I think one thing I like about the donut is it's this kind of range. So it's not saying this is the limit for you as an individual on what exactly you can have exactly, know, 1,000 kilometres of travel a year, that's it, that's your limit. It doesn't say what that is, and it doesn't say everybody's got to be the same. It just wants everybody to be in this sort of acceptable band. So it's not pretending we're going to have, everybody's going to have the same. It's just, it's hoping that you can get to a point where everybody has enough and people aren't, collectively, we're not using too much. But yeah, I mean,
The thing is, whilst in expert circles will always acknowledge that and look at societal benefits across society, I think as an individual, you kind of want to hear that it's going to be okay for you, regardless where you
Yes.
sit in the state. So, yeah, I don't.
yeah, no, I mean, it's one of the difficulties of the word sufficiency, isn't it? It's kind of worked in France, it seems, from what we understand. The sort of in France, they have this word sobriété. It's gone into high-level political discussion. It has been something that has been used beyond the confines of a small group of people, which is really where this discussion is trapped, I would say, mostly in the UK. Although things like donut economics, although it's not quite using the language, it's the same sort of ideas. And the CRED scenarios that I showed you, the bottom one was kind of sufficiency, but it didn't call it that. Perhaps because there's all those, it's kind of limited. Do I want enough? Don't I want a bit more than enough? I think there's problems with how to make that sound attractive and interesting to people.
Picking up on that, a lot of the points that they seem to make, again, I haven't read the book Abundance, but it seemed to me that a lot of the points they make about selling their vision of the future is grounded in an idea of enoughness. I mean, they're recycling this 50-hour work week, AI so productive that we don't have to work. That's an idea of enoughness. Without that, I would have AI do my regular week of work, and then I would do another week of work on top of that and just get 2 weeks for the price of one, without this kind of policy that sort of the guiding principles around enoughness that bring that down and make that possible. It's a classic sort of efficiency rebound paradox, isn't it? So I think it's interesting that they are even borrowing sufficiency ideas. I mean, one of the things that makes sufficiency so powerful is the idea that I can just live a more pleasant life, right? With less. Say I can live a more pleasant life with more. It's the same end. Other different visions. I think that's picking up on that point. It's quite interesting the way they try to sell it.
You mentioned that across the world, unfortunately, the climate people who want to solve the climate are being characterized as them, and people, and we're going to have to pay for it. Right? Do you feel that? I mean, for many people, it's the cost of things that actually really matter. So, is energy costing too much? You say renewables is the future, but is it going to cost me more? How am I going to afford that? Do you feel that maybe we're missing that? Because there's good arguments that it will be much cheaper if we just invest in it. We've got to somehow make it attractive and make sure that not everyone just now pays for it, but we can somehow spread it out. Do you feel that's one of the challenges?
Yes, and I sort of, I mean, obviously the current government, that's their kind of claim, is that by 2030 or whenever it is, the prices will start to come down, but because we're doing the big investment in renewables, prices are not going to drop in the short term. And, somehow that kind of, and that should, I mean, well, of course, a lot of people suffering in energy poverty in the UK. We know that. So there's current problems that doesn't help you with. But for the majority who are not suffering like that, somehow, I mean, you can make unpleasant visions attractive. People voted for austerity in the 2010s. They were told this is going to hurt, but it's good for you. And that sort of seemed to work as a political message. Whereas I don't know that it does work with the sort of energy cost type invest now, reap the rewards later message, which is kind of what austerity was saying, was save now and then things would be better for us as a country, we'll be more secure, it's all more stable, we're doing the right thing. I mean, I saw some event and Ed Miliband was there, and he was talking really about how this isn't going to work for people unless we can tell them they're going to be saving money on their energy bills. So it seems like the government is very keen to personalise it in that way and make sure it does deliver for people at an individual level. And that's the kind of practical side of it, isn't it? It's not the aspirational vision side of it, and it's going to be quite hard to deliver however much you want.
Just say I'm a big fan of Ed Miliband so far. And I was going to point you all to a speech that he made in front of Energy UK maybe a couple of weeks ago. It's online and on the business website, where he basically spells out why energy independence is important and why it's exactly the message of like, yes, it's not going to be easy, but it's super important that we do it. And if we don't do it, it's actually going to be much worse. And I think that comparison with how much worse it would be without it, that can also be compelling. It's a negative message, but he gives numbers on it, and it's quite compelling.
Yeah, interesting.
The other thing that he did really incredibly well in hindsight, so he rebranded demand-side response into consumer-led flexibility, which demand-side response for us is neither negative nor positive, is relatively neutral and quite descriptive from a technical perspective, but doesn't say anything, a positive story, whereas consumer-led flexibility gives you the feeling of power over your electricity.
Yeah.
So he personally rebranded it into that, and the government has only been using CLF ever since. And he's been adamant that we can't use DSR anymore to refer to it. So those kind of things that I think in the long run, they will make an impact. And as I said, I am a big fan of his because I can see things moving in ways that they haven't in the past years. But like the opposition is strong, and it's not going to be easy unless they, and I hope he keeps being stubborn and keeps like pressing on despite the criticism, but the criticism is difficult to absorb as well.
Yeah.
When I read that book, I thought about how their ideas would apply if they were writing it not from California, but from Oxford.
Okay, interesting. Yes.
So in there is a lot about how transport needs to be modernized in California, particularly with the railway line you mentioned, but also how housing needs to be made cheaper and much more building needs to be going. And you take that and you apply it to Oxford, and you end up with solar farms all around Oxford. You end up cleaning up, disappearing in order to create the housing that's necessary for the economic expansion. And perhaps most strikingly, I thought, you build a lot more roads so that people can drive their fancy electric cars around more easily from place to place. Now, all that we think of here goes against that. The ideas in that book, for example, would be completely incompatible with the creation of a congestion charge, such as probably everyone in this room knows now applies in Oxford over the last week. There is no sense in there, even for a second, of the idea of crowding, how we are actually going to be 10 billion people, and we are going to have to live with each other, against each other. And we cannot exist just doing exactly what we want. And the most extraordinary anecdote in that book that I remember is the idea that the family from California goes and stays for a weekend in London on a jet that travels at 5 times the speed of sound. That kind of mass tourism, just imagine what the effect would be if they had, instead of going to London, the thousands of extra tourists that arrived in Oxford.
That's getting serious.
Just making the point that
Yeah.
this book is written as though we individuals don't abut anybody else. That we've got abundance, everybody's got abundance. Now, what we know is that when that happens, we end up in conflict. If I have a car driving down the road, I'm going to make everybody else's journey slower. So we end up having to restrain abundance. And I almost unbelievable. I thought the book was almost unbelievably naive in that respect. Written very much from an American perspective. Yes. It would not work for 1 second.
I thought it was very American, but I mean they are Americans. They're right.
Yeah, it's fine.
But it's that mindset of of course it's it's a big country. They think about things differently. You already use a lot more energy than us. They've got a different vision, haven't they? What?
They don't. I don't think they haven't got the heritage ties. They'll knock down a city. But people won't knock down a medieval Oxford. They won't to make a new road or whatever.
Yeah, I mean,
If you wish, sure.
It's that kind of expansion, but fundamentally, kind of, it is that tension between more and more and less is more, isn't it? And I think we've had some quite good discussions examples in the discussion actually when less is, like working less is better, and actually having enough is most of the time is like, we don't want to eat too much, do we want to eat enough? And then there's all sorts of them. And as we endlessly wang on about, nobody actually wants energy, they want energy services, and there's all that stuff.
We do want bigger cars than everybody. We want bigger houses than everybody else. We want higher quality food, more expensive food. And we've been saying for, as you mentioned from the Keynes quote, for a very long time now, that just a little bit more is going to be sufficient.
Yeah, indeed.
And never seems to be the case. And quite how we get out of this addiction to endlessly consuming more, needing more energy, I cannot imagine. And I don't think the degrowth books that you've mentioned do a particularly good job of getting on top of that either.
Sometimes I wonder if they, if people sort of take the LED light bulb as some kind of, like we're just going to, tech our way out of it, we're halve our energy consumption because tech is just going to invent a way of doing everything half as consuming.
We have done pretty well with energy efficiency. It has done a lot of really cool stuff, and it hasn't all been taken back as rebounds. Really, and that story about the cars, like if we were bold enough to start restricting car size and start imposing bigger penalties on people who are taking up too much road space, as they've just done in Cardiff, they're putting higher parking charges for bigger cars because there's all sorts of social costs to big cars, as we know. It's not just about climate. Feels like there's a lot of arguments for restrictions on certain things that are causing the rest of us damage, aren't there? It's like you don't have to restrict everything, and unfortunately, housing is self-restricting, isn't it? I mean, the idea of even affording a room in a lot of cities is almost impossible for people. We're not living in bigger spaces actually, on average, not really, because of the way the housing market works.
We are using, in this country anyway, less energy than we were.
Yes, we are, exactly. And I see that as a real sign of, it's really hopeful. We've got richer, there's more of us, we're using less. That's good, but it doesn't get us to zero.
When you talk about using energy, are we always talking about useful energy, not final energy?
Well, I suppose we're delivered, final energy rather than, we're not talking about how much are we still wasting.
No.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. If anybody wants to come have a look at the retro future, Space Woman says here, women of the future will make the moon a cleaner place to live. So we've got this lovely 1960s film with the big eyelashes. So the future's going to be better. That's everything.